Hi, welcome to one of the most critical chapters on Catalan. The position starts with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, castles, dc4, and knight e5. Now, this knight e5 move is one of the biggest headaches for black players, simply because till this point, there has been no convincing attempt to play for a win as black. The main line here is knight c6, but after bishop into c6, bc6, and knight a3, this position has been tested in a lot of games. But if we talk about it from a practical point of view, it's basically a two result position where white is playing for a win or white might make a draw. Most probably it will be a draw, but we have zero winning chances whatsoever. There is also the dreaded knight c6, and after queen e8, knight into e7, queen into e7, queen a4, where you are a pawn down. Of course, we have compensation, but if it's anyone playing for win, it's going to be white. And this has pushed a lot of black players from avoiding the d into c4 variation. Because if you're playing for a win, knight e5 is the biggest obstacle for you. However, I think I managed to find a very good line here. And this gives us a lot of chances compared to the other variations. Of course, white still has attempts to play for equalizing. In fact, okay, if the position is going to be equal, what I mean is white still has attempts to try and make a forced draw. I'm not denying that, but it's already much harder than the variations with knight c6. And secondly, white might get a lot of difficulties in the sense that the line is very new, and when you are unprepared, position is complex, that's when you make mistakes. And what I recommend is knight d5, which has been tested in a couple of high level games by a few players, but this has been really unexplored. The idea is to play b5, stop this bishop from attacking the rook on a8, and keep the pawn on c4. White obviously wants to play knight into c4 here. Okay, white might try a4 and claim that we are stopping black from playing b5. But now the very key difference is we have c5, which we had not on the last move, because after c5, d into c5, white is threatening to exchange the queens and then take on c4, where we have issues after knight c3, knight b5, and some knight c7 ideas. These knights on c4 and c3, along with the bishop on g2, would be really active. But after knight d5, a4, c5, white can't take on c5 now, because after bishop into c5, white is not able to exchange the queens. And if white's not able to do that, that means we have great centralized pieces, and then we can easily develop our pieces. We also have a juicy outpost on b4, which we may access via the a6 square, or if white takes on c4 with the knight on e5, we might jump to c6 as well. So a4, c5, the critical move is e4. White gains space and pushes our knight back. We play knight b4. Obviously, we want to march forward and attack white's weakness on d3. If we now look into it, d3 is simply an outpost because there is no pawn controlling the square. White's main point is d5 because you can't take on c4 due to c into d4, and then black remains a pawn up. d5, white gains space and creates a passed pawn right in the middle of the board. White's point is, if we play e into d5, white wants to play e into d5. And although we have ideas of bishop f6, white keeps a small advantage due to the active knight on e5 and the passed pawn right in the center of the board. We have to play e d5 at some point, but it's better if we exchange pieces. Why? Because we have less space. Therefore, we start with knight d7. We develop our worst place piece and ask white to exchange it. White obviously doesn't want to do that, and so white will play knight into c4. And yeah, we can take on d5, but I again want to offer a trade of pieces, where white can't play knight e5 due to e into d5 and we win a pawn. So white either needs to play knight e3, but that restricts the bishop on c1, or white needs to take on b6. Let's start with knight into b6. And here's again a question for you. Should you take back with the queen, or is a into b6 better? So the best move here is a into b6. Why? Because as usual, you are opening up a file for your rook and you're bringing a new piece into the game. Queen b6, well, the queen's not doing anything special on b6. With a b6, you open up a diagonal for, a file for a fresh piece. The queen's still hinting at the d5 pawn, so, and it's really not doing anything on b6. So I don't see a very significant development there. But yeah, from a8 to a1, this is a very big important point in favor for black. White probably might try knight c3, bringing a new piece into the game. But now we take on d5, and the key difference is after e into d5, we don't have a bad piece for white's amazing knight on e5, and we can play bishop f5 and bring our last piece into the game. Now we have ideas of bishop f6, getting the dark square bishop into the game as well as hinting towards this weak squares on d4, d3, and c2. I presume the ideas could be knight c2, bishop c2, bishop into c3, knight d5. You might also try to bring the last piece into the game with rook e8, develop the queen to d7. And in general, this passed pawn doesn't seem to be a worry for us, mainly because the squares on d4 and d3 are very weak and we can intercept it at any given point. And that's why whites can try knight e3 here. Probably this is white's best bet. Now, white wants to play knight c3, but before that, white wants to play a5 and kick our knight on b6. To stop that, we play a5. This is the last critical move of the entire variation, and all you need to remember now is to play bishop f6 on the next move. Maybe try playing bishop d4, or you can play e d5 and get your c8 bishop into the game. After something like knight c3, bishop f6, we have a very sharp position, but our pieces are quite strong. White's bishop on c1 is restricted by the knight on e3, and you probably want to play bishop d7, developing your last minor piece, and then you might try to reroute this knight to d6 via c8. d6, as you already know, is a great square for the knight in Carlsbad structures, as well as in positions where your opponent has a passed pawn. So a passed pawn is best blockaded by a knight, and that's why we are trying to reroute the knight to d6. Even if we don't do that, we might try putting pressure on the pawn on a4 with queen e8 or bishop into c3, and in overall the position just looks really fun to play as black. Let's go back, and that's why the line with a4, probably not the best choice for white. White should play knight into c4. And if we talk about this position, white has more space and the knight on c4 looks really good. So what was it that made this line interesting for us? Well, with our last move, knight d5, we have blockaded the bishop. So the very key difference between knight e5 lines with knight c6 and knight e5 with knight d5 included is that we have b5. And this was our main point. The idea is that you are now preparing bishop b7, and white doesn't have this control on the white has control. I'm sorry for that, but we can challenge it with bishop b7. And more than that, we are gaining space with b5. Our idea is to follow up with c5 and eliminate the pawn on d4, which is the main reason for white's spatial advantage. Now white has multiple attempts. There is the centralizing of knight with knight e5, which is the most natural move. There is knight a5, which is the top computer choice, but never been played in any practical game. And I don't think it would ever be played unless your opponent is very well prepared. There is knight e3. And then there is knight cd2. Let's start with the top computer choice, knight a5. Again, this has been tried in no practical games simply because it's very unusual And I don't see even 27, 2800 grandmasters making this move without actually being prepared for it. White's idea is that White wants to create a grip on the c5 square. That's an outpost for now. We are threatening to eliminate that with c5, and we play the natural c5. What is it that White wanted to do here? Well, the move is the shocking knight c3. Of course, we are not afraid of knight b3, where you can take on d4, but I prefer gaining space with c4. And now we have more space. We have our pieces getting into the game with knight c6, queen b6, putting pressure on the pawn on d4. You're also trying to gain further space with a5, a4, a3, or at probably b4 at some point. Knight on c5 is quite shaky. And if the knight goes to d2, well, you restrict two of your pieces. Again, the practical value of white's pieces isn't great here. So this is a fantastic position for us. White's idea is this knight c3. And I find it very amusing that something like this works. The point is that if we play queen into a5, after knight d5, e into d5, bishop into d5, our rook on a8 is trapped. We have to give back material with knight c6, but that would result us in being material down with bishop c6, rook b8. We are already a pawn down, but after bishop f4, things are even worse. Rook b6, bishop c7, and you even go on to lose an exchange. So this doesn't work. That means after knight c3, we can play a6, controlling the b5 square, and at the same time, creating an escape square for the rook with rook a7. So that means we are threatening queen into a5 now. White needs to react against it. The passive knight b3 isn't great. As we already know, you want to keep on making threats. You don't want to make retreating moves with your pieces. Knight b3 does that, and we can exploit that with c4. We gain space, get our c4 pawn out of the attack, and then we want to play knight c6, maybe bishop b7, or try to put pressure on the pawn on d4 with bishop f6 or queen b6 at some point. We have more space. We have a centralized knight. I don't see any problems for us in this position. If white plays knight into d5, we have to take back with the pawn. And again, we are threatening queen into a5. So the most natural move seems to be bishop d2, developing a new piece and defending the piece at the same time. Knight b3 as usual is passive, and we can play c4. But there is also the very strong computerist suggestion of bishop f4, which again, I don't think Magnus can find it if he doesn't know that knight a5 works. I mean, you have to really spot this before playing knight a5. And I would be very impressed with Magnus as well if he plays something like bishop f4. The point is, you are stopping queen a5 due to bishop into d5. And we can't play rook a7 anymore due to bishop into b8. Seems very, very difficult given the fact that the knight on a5 is hanging, and your instinct as a chess player is to defend that knight rather than trying to find for counterattack. Of course, this is the best strategy, and this is the kind of moves you should be looking for, but hey, everyone makes mistakes, and chess is not ideal, right? You are going to make mistakes all the time, and spotting moves like bishop f4 is just really, really impressive for any player. Now we can't play queen a5, which means we need to play c4. We control the b3 square for the knight, and now the idea is the knight on a5 is trapped. So even if you spot bishop f4, you need to see c4 and then find out a good resource for white, which, your knight is on a5 is trapped on a corner of the board. So this is not really comfortable unless you have a very concrete follow-up plan. White has two ways to do that. There is queen e1, defending the a5 knight, but I feel this is a bit artificial. The more natural move would be to play queen d2. But let's start with queen e1. And the point is, white keeps the option of playing e4. And at some point, we had ideas of b4 and c3. So before explaining what's wrong with queen e1, Let me show you what's the point with queen d2. We play bishop e6. We get our minor piece in. White plays b3. White's trying to undermine our pawns on the center because bc runs into knight c4, and then there is bishop into a8. If white plays e4 here, white's trying to open up the center, but after de4, bishop e4, we have bishop d5. We cement our bishop on the outpost, and then we want to play bishop f6, maybe put pressure on the pawn on d4, and if we get something like bishop into d5, queen into d5 in, we'll be putting a lot of pressure on the pawn. We might then try to get our knight. The knight on a5 is out of the game, so black is clearly dominating here. Rook f1 is also slow, and we can just play queen d7, threatening to play knight c6. If we trade off the knights, the knight on a5 is misplaced, but at the same time, our knight on b8 isn't great either. And if we play knight c6, just chop it off, we'll remain better due to more space, partly due to the pawn on c4. So white's best bet is to play b3. And here's where it gets interesting. Because white has played b3, we have ideas of playing c3. The point being that after queen c3, we want to play b4. But here's the problem. This looks very impressive, but white has queen c7. And we can't attack the knight on a5 anymore. Because of that, we play g5, force the bishop back to e3. Okay, computer says to play bishop into b8, but you are giving up your bishop pair. And after queen into b8, black has the advantage of bishop pair. White's best bet is to play knight c6, looking to exchange of the bishop on e7. But after queen c7, knight e7, queen into e7, we have a very complicated position on the board, which we are hoping for, by the way. Black has more space on the queen side. Black also has a protected passed pawn, which is a very big deal. But there is some issues as well. The bishop on e6 is slightly bad. The bishop on g2 looks great. And we have played g5, which means we have some weaknesses on the king side. The position is balanced according to computer, but I think anything can happen here. Our game plan should be to chop off as many pieces as we can, safeguard our king, and any endgame is winning for us. For white, it's about creating attack against our king. With that in mind, I think the principal move is f4. White is trying to open up the position on the king side. We have to take because f5 was threatened, and then the pawn on d5 would have been hanging. But after rook f4, if we give white a move, yeah, white would be better. But we shut down all the play with f5. Stopping e4, and then we have ideas of rook e8, rook f6, cementing everything on the king side, making sure everything's safe, and then trying to gain more space on the queen side by playing b4, c3, or maybe queen c7. We are in no rush to push those pawns. It's more important to neutralize the activity on the king side. Computer says it's equal. I believe anything can happen. And this is a great outcome resulting from the variation with knight e5. White players who play knight e5 want to make a draw. This is not the position they are hoping for. Let's go back. By the way, if white plays bishop e5, white wants to keep the c7 square control. We can start with b4. And now because queen into a5 is threatened, white needs to play knight b7. We'll play queen b6, of course. And white's point is knight c5. We can't take on c5 because of the hanging pawn on g5. But we can play knight d7, offer to exchange our worst placed piece for a good piece of white's. And after knight into d7, because we are threatening knight into e5 and bishop c5, if white plays knight e6, alright, we play queen e6, and then we'll win the bishop on e5, either by capturing with the knight or trapping it with f6. So knight into d7, bishop into d7, bishop into d5. White has won a pawn, but after c3, we have great compensation. We want to play rook c8. We'll be happy to chop off the light square bishops with bishop c6. And the king side isn't that dangerous here, simply because we always have ideas of f6. Without the dark square bishops, things were a bit more complicated, but with the dark square bishop, our position is alright. Of course, we are a pawn down. But now we have more activity and a safer king compared to the previous position. I think it's balanced and anything can happen here, which is what we are hoping for. A good point to end the variation. And let's go back to the crucial bishop e3. But here's what our point, when our point is revealed and we play c3. White is forced to take, but after b4, we are winning the piece with queen a5. Why black would have been winning basically if white didn't have queen d2, with the idea that after queen a5 there is bishop g5. But okay, we are already very much better here. We have plenty of choices, and ultimately white is a piece down. You might try playing bishop, queen d8, queen c. I will play queen d8, but there are other options as well. The attack on king side isn't dangerous, and you have an extra piece. Let's go back. Yeah, so knight a5 isn't great. We have checked that c5 is quite strong. The other move is knight e3 with the idea of knight into d5, e into d5, which means that pushing c5 would be impossible due to d into c5 and the pawn on d5 being weak. And then white wants to play knight d2, knight b3 and control the outpost on c5. We have two moves here. There is bishop b7, which has been played in two of the corresponding games in the position. And then there is c6, which I personally prefer. Let's start with why bishop b7 isn't great, because it looks like the most natural option. Yep. So with bishop b7, what white can do is play knight into d5, bishop into d5. The bishop on d5 in the center looks amazing, but white has e4. And the point is, we are forced to retreat with the bishop, and that gives white a great space advantage right in the center of the board. If we play something like bishop c4, white has rook e1, and after knight c6, okay, the position's sharp, but white has more space, and there are threats along this diagonal. If anyone's better here, it's white, and I don't think black's play is very easy, also due to the fact that there is b3, which might trap our bishop. So we need to play c6, controlling the d5 square with the knight. Now with the pawn, excuse me, if you take with the knight, this is what we want. We want to play c into d5, and then we get the c6 square accessible for our knight. So our knight's jumping to c6, and then we can try to gain space on the queen side with a5, b4, queen b6, something like bishop a6 or a4, bishop b7. The other bishop can jump to f6, and most importantly, white's bishop on g2 has been nullified. So white has two key ideas here. Knight g4, which was played in the only correspondence game in this position, or knight c3. Let's start with knight g4. White wants to keep the knights on the board because white has more space, but the knight has already moved 1, 2, 3, and now for the fourth time. We play bishop b7. Now we bring the bishop to the best possible square, and we want to play c5, challenging white's pawn on d4. White probably should play e4, white's gaining space and forcing us to retreat with our knight. We go back to b6, again threatening to play c5. The only good way to stop it is by playing e5, because c5 isn't possible due to bishop into b7. But now we can bring our knight back, knight d5. If white plays knight c3, with the idea that after knight into c3, b into c3, white would have a great bind over these squares. Sure, that's true, but we'll play c5, sacrifice our pawn. Why? Because after knight into b5, we'll get a new piece into the game with queen d7. As usual, we are prioritizing activity over material. We want to get our pieces in, and that will be our compensation for the missing pawn. Knight c3. Computer prefers knight d6, giving back the pawn to win the bishop pair. Again, computer emphasizes on strategic factors, which are not really just related to material. Bishop pair in an open position is also a strategic triumph. We play bishop d6, e into d6. Now, queen into d6 is possible, but d into c5 comes up with a tempo. So we play c into d4, force the queen up with queen d4. Why? Because now we can develop a piece, knight c6 with the tempo, and the queen has to go back. So we get one extra move for development. Queen d2, with the idea of playing b3 and bb2. But after queen d6, we have recovered the material losses. b3, and if white is able to play bishop b2, white probably will have a small advantage, mainly due to the pair of bishops. We stop that with queen b4. The idea is after queen b4, knight c b4. White doesn't have a very good setup with bishop b2 now because the c file is in our control. We are also getting knight d3 in. The c3 square is very weak. Plus, we have ideas of a5 and a4 trying to attack white's weaknesses on the queen side. This position is equal, but the player who plays a better endgame should win here. Let's go back. Knight c3. And now we take on c3, spoil white's pawn structure, b into c3. We take on g2, exchange of the light square pieces to create some weaknesses on the king side, king into g2. Now that these squares on the king side and the center are weak, we now take on d4. Why? Because we are creating a target right into the center of the board. If white plays c into d4, we have knight c6, followed by rook d8, and we'll recover the pawn, then have a better position because the knight on g4 is misplaced and there is a great outpost on d5. Black's pieces would remain slightly better. And if white plays queen d4, this means that the pawn structure is weak, and we exploit that with queen c6 check, king g1, get a new piece into the game with rook d8. I think I've been repeating this for the 100th time, but it doesn't matter because it's one of the most important principles of the game. Even if you feel that, okay, this is a course about opening, the principle of bringing all of your pieces into the game and attacking your opponent's weaknesses, putting them on the best squares, is one of the most important principles and is universal, be it end games, middle games, openings. So please don't mind me repeating the same principle again and again. I would say that rather than concrete moves, even if you want to have one takeaway from this course, it's getting your pieces on the best squares. Queen e3. White's trying to defend the c3 pawn and kind of keeping the material advantage. But the issue is the knight on g4 is misplaced, and we can exploit that with h5, winning a piece. The knight is trapped, and if white doesn't play queen e3, pardon me, you'll lose the pawn on c3. So this brings us an end to the variation with knight g4. White needs to play knight c3 here. Excuse me for a second, guys. I've noticed this funny thing. Whenever I go and drink a glass of water, my pinky finger goes up, and I think it's got to do with one of the players I observed making moves, who makes a move like this. I was influenced by him when I was younger. He was one of my coaches, and I still have character traits. So the more you see of one thing, the environment around you makes a lot of changes. You get familiar with it, and the point I'm trying to make is, if I'm emphasizing the same point again and again, you might think, okay, why should I hear it for the 100th time? If you keep on hearing that same principle, at some point you're going to remember that in the game and do that. I'm not sure this is a healthy habit, but the healthy habit of looking for the best square for my pieces is always there. All right, let's come back to chess. With knight c3, white basically again wants us to take on c3 because after bc3 there is some pressure on this diagonal. We obviously don't do that, And by now, you know the principle I'm referring to. I am asking you to develop your pieces, put them on good squares. So, knight d7. We are looking to play knight f6, and then we want to play queen b6, bishop b7, and then try to challenge white's center with c5. White's best try is clearly knight e into d5. Since knight c d5 allows c into d5 and our pawn structure is fixed, it's repaired, there are no weaknesses. While with knight e into d5, we can't take with the c pawn due to the hanging b5 pawn, so we need to play e into d5. Now this makes a weakness on c6, but at the same time, the bishop on g2 is bad, and we are looking to play knight f6 and get our light square bishop out with bishop f5. So that means we'll have no bad pieces whatsoever, and we'll get rid of the typical bad bishop on the light square in the typical QGD structures. At the same time, we can try to exploit the advanced pawns with a5, a4. So there is a disadvantage, but there's a benefit too. And if we are able to play knight f6 and bishop f5, then we'll get a5, a4, and then a3, b4 in the game. So white's best try is probably e4. Bishop f4 is slow. I don't know why I put an exclamation mark here. Probably I was going for something like dubious, and mistakenly I put exclamation here. We just play knight f6. Rook c1, okay, white tries to develop a piece, but we get our last piece into the game. And after queen b3, we'll gain space with a5. And actually, it's black who's better here. We have more space. Our pieces are completely fine. The pawn on c6 is not really weak. We'll play queen d7. If required, we'll also play rook fc8. And our ideas is very clear. We want to play a4, a3, b4, and so on. So the critical move here is opening up the center with e4. There is also this rule. If the flank is not closed properly, you should try to open up the position. In the center, I mean. White has a lead in development, and so white is trying to exploit our weaknesses on the queen side. If we play de4, we invite white to play bishop into e4 and put the bishop on a better square. Rather than that, I want white to take so that I improve the position of my piece. Knight b6. E into d5. If you play e5 and gain space, this means the pawn on d5 is no longer weak, and I can start doing my own stuff with a5, followed by a4, bishop f5, and the typical a3, b4 ideas, or b4 directly. Black remains better because the bishop on c1 is bad and is restricted by white's pawn on d4 and e5. E into d5. And now if we take back with the knight, white has knight d5, c d5, and queen b3, attacking both of our weaknesses. So we need to play b4. We are forcing the knight to move so that after knight e4, we have knight into d5, and we have this amazing outpost for our knight. Our plan is simple. We want to play queen b6 and then bishop e6 or bishop f5. White has a better pawn structure, but we have this amazing knight on d5, which neutralizes the bishop on g2. And then we want to play queen b6, defending c6 pawn. And we have somewhat more space due to the pawn of b4. So the position is balanced, and I think it's a very interesting position with chances for both the sides. Knight cd2. White wants to play knight b3 and create a grip on the c5 square, but this restricts both the pieces on b1 and c1. If we place that natural c5, white now has d into c5, bishop into c5, and knight b3. This opens up the diagonal for the bishop. This is a big problem. So what we can do is we can play a5 with the very clever idea that if white plays knight b3, now we have a4, and the knight doesn't want to retreat to d2 because then you restrict your pieces all over again. We have gained space in the meantime. And well, if you play knight c5, we'll easily exchange it with the b8 knight with knight a6 or knight d7. And keep in mind that this knight has traveled from g1 to f3, e5, c4, d2, b3, c5, all to get exchanged with the knight on b8. This has got to be good for us. We have this amazing knight on d5. we have more space and will remain better. So knight b3 isn't great. If white plays a4 with the idea that b4 gives white a very healthy outpost on c4, we'll just play the typical b into a4, rook into a4, and now challenge white's center with the very natural c5. Now our idea is simple. We want to play c into d4. And if white plays d into c5, rather than taking back with the bishop, we can exploit the rook on a4 is weak and play knight d7 with the idea of improving the worst placed piece with knight into c5 and attacking the rook at the same point. So white needs to play knight c3 here. We obviously can't take on c3 because of the hanging rook. I mean bc3. You still can play c6, but then this creates unnecessary weaknesses. So we want to play c6 first. Ask white to take on d5 so that we play cd5 and improve our pawn structure. White's best idea is to play a4, try to create weaknesses on the queen side. We have to play b4. Since now ba4, rook a4, c5 would be a move slower due to the knight on c3, we are forced to play b4. White plays knight e4. Now white has a good knight, but the bishop on c1 is still restricted. If white is able to finish the development, yeah, white will be better because of our weaknesses. We don't want to allow that. The knight on e4 is amazing, so f5. I'm sorry. I had this motive of f5 in the mind, but if we play f5, white has knight c5. So we start with knight d7, stopping knight c5, bringing a fresh piece. White plays knight b3, and now f5, right? I'm human too. I make mistakes. Knight ed2. If white plays knight ec5, we take on c5, and we have eliminated our bad knight on b8 for this knight who has moved, I don't know, numerous times to be very. I think it comes back to it comes back to c4, then comes back to d4. No, it comes to b3 and then it comes to c5, right? So it has moved so many times that it's very good to trade it with the knight on b8. And if white plays knight ed2, so you have some weaknesses to attack to, but now I have the initiative with c5. Black wants to play queen b6 or bishop b7 next, and we remain with a very comfortable position due to our active pieces. dc5 is great because now we have knight into c5 and all our pieces are looking very healthy. We have the open c file for our rook, the queen's jumping into b6. Everything's fine for us, while white's pieces don't look promising at all. So that brings us an end to the line with knight cd2. And that brings us to 95. I don't know why I'm feeling so itchy today. So I'm sorry. Probably I'm doing it for the 10th time, but yeah, I can't stop recording. And yeah, life goes on. 95. The most natural move. White is centralizing the knight. And at the same time, white's renewing the threat of knight d3, stopping c5. We play the natural bishop b7. And now we want to play c5 because dc5, bishop c5, the knight on d5 is supported, so white can create an isolated pawn. White now again has a few choices. There is knight c3, there is a4, there is e4, there is knight d2, and then there is queen b3. Let's start with the natural knight c3. With knight c3, white is challenging our knight on d5, but now we can take on c3. The big difference being that after bc3, we can actually chop off white's bishop without creating any weaknesses on the queen side. And after king g2, white has a slightly poor pawn structure, which we try to exploit with queen d5 check, improving the position of the queen. The king goes back, and now challenging white's center with c5. We now want to play f6 on the next move, and we can try playing cd4 or play c4, create a bind on the light squares, maybe play knight c6 and f5 at some point, and then a5, b4, start gaining space on the queen side. Or else we can play rook d8, c into d4, and try to hammer down the pawn on d4. This knight c3 is what we are hoping for, but white might also try something like a4 with the same idea that b4 creates an outpost. But we have a very standard reply to these a4 ideas, which is to take on a4. And after rook a4, queen a4, we can play c5, but it's better to play knight b6, exchange of this great bishop on g2. Sorry for that. And only after something like bishop into g2, then try to play c5. White's only move is queen d1 to keep the pawn on d4 guarded. But after bishop g2, king g2, queen d5 check. Again, we are delaying c5 because we are getting our pieces out, right? With a tempo. So we want to play c5, but whenever possible, put your pieces onto the best possible squares. King g1 and only now c5. The position's fine, but it's clear that black is slightly better due to the better placed pieces. The queen on d5 and the knight on b6 is better than white's pieces. The knight on e5 looks good, but it's under huge pressure. This isn't great as well. And if white plays rook into a4, we play knight d7. We want to play c5, but let's eliminate our worst placed piece. I'm sorry, the color should be different. Yeah. The worst placed piece for white's amazing knight on e5, for which white has spent probably 7 or 8 moves. Knight d7, queen d7, and now we'll play c5. This position is actually far more balanced than the previous one with queen a4, but we still have plenty of pieces on the board. White still has many ways to go wrong here. It's equal, but you have chances. What I would say is just prioritize activating your pieces here. So you want to play c5. White might try to stop that with queen c2. Then you get your f8 rook out to rook to c8 and then try to play c5. The idea should be to put your pieces on the best squares and then you're trying to put pressure on white's position. With best play, white's probably fine. I'm not denying that. But if you put your pieces to your best squares, I think white's going to be in some trouble. By the way, e4 isn't good because this restricts the bishop on g2, which we are very happy about. And only now we play knight f6 because the pawn on e4 is hanging. So we have a concrete threat with knight f6. After rook e1, since this bishop is restricted, c5. dc5, bishop c5 would have give us a great position. This bishop is good. This bishop is bad as this is defending. This is attacking. A good idea to judge good pieces and bad pieces is by looking at the piece which is making threat and looking at the piece which is defending. The defending side usually has an inferior piece, while the side making threats has a better piece. So with bishop b7, if white plays knight d2 with the idea of knight b3, well, let's chop off our worst placed piece, knight d7. We want to play c5. White can probably try to stop that with takes, and knight b3. And okay, white says, hey, I have slightly more space. Not for a long time, my friend. a5. I want to play a4. If your knight goes back, I'll eliminate that space advantage with c5. And if you play knight c5, then I'll happily take on c5, creating a weakness since b4 isn't possible due to the pawn on a4. We'll then try to attack the pawn on c5 with queen e7 or queen c6, maybe get our pieces into the game, and our position is completely fine. So the best move for white is to improve the queen and make a threat with queen b3. a6, we defend the pawn and our threat as usual to eliminate white's space advantage with c5. You will see that I'm repeating probably one element of the game again and again, but if you look at it, that is a boon and a bane as well. Bane in the sense that your opponent knows what you are trying to do, but boon in the sense that you know what you are trying to do, and even if your opponent knows that, it's not easy to stop it. That's how I think the good opening play should be. Your strategy should be well defined. You should know what you're looking for. And let's say you don't remember the concrete lines, right? But because you have heard me repeating it for 100 times, you now know that you're looking to eliminate white space advantage with c5. You are very happy to exchange the knight, which has moved 8 or 9 times, with your knight on b8. And just by knowing these elements, chances are that you will find most moves on the board most of the times, even if you don't know the concrete response. a4, white stops us from playing c5. If you play knight c3, it's a bit different than the position we had earlier. Why? Because after knight c3, white has queen into c3. Of course, there's no point playing b into c3 and spoiling the pawn structure. We change the light square bishops, exchange the active bishop, king g2, now eliminate white space advantage with c5. I'm actually quite bored repeating the same thing again and again, but I'll be thrilled if you win games, and that's more important than whether I'm enjoying it or not. Queen into c3, white doesn't spoil the pawn structure, but takes, again, queen d5 check, improving the queen, king g1. White might try to cry for a draw with queen f3. We have no choice but to take on f3 as queen d5 was threatened, knight f3, and as usual, c5. bc5, bishop into c5. And okay, let's start by talking about this position. From the first glance, it seems absolutely helpless as a dead draw. It feels as if white has achieved their strategy, which is true to some extent. This is probably the most dry position we have got. But white had to display some accuracy, and it's not like the position is already over. To give you a sample line, let's try to look at some natural moves from white's end. Bishop f4. By the way, your idea is to play f6, e5, gain space, and then try to get the king into the board and maybe slowly progress on both the flanks. a5, a4, f with after f6, e5, king f7, king e6, maybe g5, h5. I'm not saying that you have a clearly well-defined winning plan. No, but white has some issues developing the bishop on c1. There is an concept which I would like to highlight. I'm just making some random moves. This is not related to the opening. Let's say b3, f6, bishop b2, e5. And basically what we are doing is we are neutralizing the bishop with these dark square pawns. This same concept applies with pawns on d5 and c6 with the white bishop on g2. I don't know what it's called. I had a Russian coach, Grandmaster Faruk Amonatov, who now lives in Dubai. And he had this concept of calling it as breakwater, which is obviously not theoretically correct. But his point is that the pawns on f6 and e5 act as a dam, which means they restrict the flow of the bishop on b2. You're free to call it whatever you want to. I am not saying that the theoretical definition is probably right, but the concept is the pawns on f6 and e5 neutralize the bishop on b2. White probably plays bishop f4. This is the most natural move to me. Now we can play knight d7. Let's say white plays rook fd1, knight b6, rook ac1. White's doing all the natural moves, bringing pieces into the game. But we have some pull. Let's say we play rook fc8. And our idea is very obvious, f6 e5, gaining space. Then I want to bring my king into the game. If I get all of this, I'm putting pressure already. I'm also looking to jump with my knight. So it's not dead as of now. It's very equal. I'll give you that, but it's not dead. Let's say white plays rook c2 with the idea that after f6, rook c1, I want to chop off everything. Sure, go ahead. Bishop f8. Rook c8, rook c8, rook c8, knight c8. Now we have only two minor pieces on the board, but white can't stop e5, king f7, king e6. Then we'll get king to d5 in the center, and then it's absolutely not clear how white makes a draw. It's not then a dead equal position. It's a two result position with us winning or the position being a draw. And that is what we are looking for. Of course, this is one of the most driest positions. We can't always get a winnable position as black, but needless to say, there is still some pressure, and don't underestimate how many mistakes your opponent can make. All your job is to make good moves, keep on improving the position of your pieces, keep on making good moves, look at your opponent's resources, and you can slowly increase the pressure little by little till they crack. Let's go back. And if white plays king g1 here, we have c5, as usual, challenging white's space with a very comfortable position. Let's go back to the 11th move, where instead of knight c3, white can try playing a4. Now, we obviously don't want to play b4. We can't play c5 because of a into b5. What does it leave us with? What is the concept which I've repeated for 10 times? Chop off your light bad bishop for your opponent's good knight. Knight d7. I hope this gives you were able to spot this, and just having these mind maps would help you immensely. At least it helps me when I'm trying to memorize lines. Having few clear concepts that this is what I want to do, this is my strategic goal, makes your life so much easier. White has a b5, knight d7, and knight d3. Let's start with knight d7. If white is exchanging the only active knight which has moved 1, 2, 3. I've actually lost count. That okay, I think it was 4 moves, right? And then 5th. For a piece which has moved only once, it's got to be fine for us. Queen d7, ab5, ab5, and it is in fact us who's putting some pressure here due to the centralized knight, and we have more active pieces. Our idea is to challenge the weakness on d4 with bishop f6, or maybe play c5 and challenge the pawn, or maybe play rook a4 and b4, gain space, or with rook a4 what you are trying to do is attack the pawn. Of course, you need to be mindful of the bishop on b7, but it comes into effect when you play c5, dc5, bishop c5, and then ideas of rook a4 come into play. This is not a problem. And knight d3 is also very slow. What do? Challenge white space with c5. dc5, knight c5. Knight c5, bishop c5. And it feels like white has won a pawn with a b5, but the queen on b3 is hanging, which we can exploit with queen b6, and then we'll take on b5. And now 1, 2, 3 minor pieces developed. Only one piece developed. We have a slight lead in activity of pieces, giving us a small advantage. Let's go back. A into b5. White wins a pawn. Or does white? Knight into e5. We spoil white's pawn structure. D e5. A into b5. So if we are able to defend the pawn, we'll remain slightly better due to the better pawn structure. White's only critical try is takes and queen into b5, claiming that white has won a pawn. But we have a tactical motive of improving our piece, and this always happens. There will always be surprising tactical resources, but all of them are fundamentally connected. So if you have good positioning of your pieces, or your opponent has a bad positioning of pieces, you most of the times you will have tactical resources which favor you. It might seem surprising, but it's just that fundamentally the position is going to favor you, right? Chess has some guidelines, and the guidelines would come into your favor. Bishop a6. Challenging the pawn on e2. Queen b3 is bad, as bishop e2, rook e1. You get your last piece in with rook b8, and now black's putting a lot of pressure. So queen d. The critical try is bishop d5. We can't take on b5 because of bishop a8. Rook a8. Okay, the position is drawish, but we are looking to win. E d5. And white has queen d7 with the claim that bishop e2, there is queen into e7. But we have this very strong queen d8. And now what we are doing is we are exchanging of white's only active piece. So after queen d8, rook d8, white is only left with poorly placed pieces, and white is already in grave trouble. We have a pair of bishops, we have active pieces, and we also have a better pawn structure. Sure, white has a pawn, but white needs to give it back, since if you try to defend it with rook e1, your position is already considerably worse. We can start gaining space in the center, expanding our territory with d4. Now, if white makes a developing move like knight d2, after bishop b4, there is just huge pressure on the board. The bishops look monstrous. There is ideas of d3. If you play e3, the bishop on c1 is dead, and the pawn on d3 remains a passed pawn. If you play ed3, rook d3, and just look at the activity of the pieces. That brings us to an end to the chapter with knight e5. And so this chapter with the idea of 95 knight d5, it's not well played. It has some risks, some small strategic risks, but I think what we have able to cover here gives us very good chances to play for a win. Just remember the principles of keeping your pieces on good squares, exchanging the g2 bishop, the light square bishop, and challenging white center with c5. Sorry, the last point to add is probably to exchange of the bad knight on b8 with the good knight on d7. Just these four principles would be good enough to go and play a game. So that brings us to the end of the chapter, and I'll see you in the next one.